Neil, do you want to reframe what you just said, or should I just summarize it super quickly? Up to you.
Sure, I'll just say that there are election officials that in this day and age want to be able to provide really good provenance for stuff that they source, things like election results and ballot images and cast vote records and all kinds of things, along with obviously candidates and so on. But many election officials have a .gov email address and have .gov websites. And so the question is, is it possible for SCITT to be used by them to give some good provenance for stuff they want to have signatures for?
So when we're talking about SCITT and identities, we encode identities within OpenID Connect tokens. What this means is that however the OpenID Connect token was obtained, that is opaque to SCITT. We don't care how it was obtained. For example, there are services like GitHub Actions that generate OpenID Connect tokens that conform to the OpenID Connect spec for the tokens themselves. And they also provide the well-known endpoints so that they're verifiable, but there's not actually a OAuth flow in order to get this token. So for example, there's a whole class of examples where the identities can be for workload identities, and it's automated signing without having something that is that requires developer interaction, like in this case here. I think for the example of the government, I had actually looked at one point, I think it was login.gov. So when we say SCITT, we can mean one of two things. It can be either the public instance of SCITT, that we can refer to as the public good instance. That's what you access when you go to SCITT.dev and any of the APIs hosted there. Or we can be talking about privately hosted instances where you can configure support for any OAuth provider without any opinions. When we talk about the public instance, the maintainers of the service, myself being one of them, try to have a very, very light hand when it comes to services that we want to support. So if somebody says, hey, I have an identity provider that I want to include, 99% of the time we're going to do it. It's more just making sure that, we're not including somebody's identity provider that they're running out of their basements and there's no SLO. They don't really plan to actually support it. In terms of how this gets supported, either you have this developer-based login flow where there's somebody who's going to click a button and say, I'm going to sign in, which is sort of the use case that you're talking about. And that's where, if you're talking to GitHub, Google, Microsoft, there's this UI that gets presented to users where they can click which identity provider they want to authenticate. And then there's also opportunities to do automated signing, which I think is maybe interesting too. Again, this kind of depends on if we're talking about things like workload identity or automating developer-based signing. When I say developer-based signing, I mean user-based signing. So that's kind of another thing here that's interesting to explore that wouldn't involve people who don't necessarily know when they're clicking a button what this actually means to be able to do signing. It just means it looks like very different authentication flows. But again, in terms of what SCITT is going to accept, it's an OpenID Connect identity token. And then, if I kind of abstract this away to SCITT, it's just some sort of identity credential that's been presented to the CA. So I think the TLDR here is if concretely we're looking to test this out with the government, and I think if we mean login.gov, we most certainly could integrate that into the public instance, or I can give some pointers for how to set this up if you want to explore this for your own deployment as well.
So I'm somebody that works with election officials. I have nothing to do with login.gov or their own infrastructure. I'm a consultant. Do you think do you have any evidence, or do you know if login.gov actually is able to generate precisely the kinds of OpenID credentials that you're looking for,
I believe
Okay.
so. I just dropped a link in chat. I had looked at this some months ago because I think it had come up in another context. So I believe it can.
And so does it require, well, I guess then there's two levels. Can I ask you to add them to your list, or do they need to make a formal request, or could, and independently, could someone who sets up their own instance, do a private instance, could they do it without having approval? Or, you know, like, how do you think those the approvals for doing that would work?
In terms of setting up with the public instance, if they provide a way to register with them, which is, for example, how GitHub, Google, or Microsoft work as standard OAuth clients, the Sigstore public instance is able to register with them, create a, I believe it's an application ID, and then we'd be able to do the OAuth dance to be able to get tokens for users when they authenticate. For that process, again, assuming that they provide this mechanism to register with them, we'd be able to do so and add it to the public instance fairly easily. And after this call, I'll go file an issue to look into this a little bit. When it comes to private instances, I assume it would be the same process. My question would be, is if they don't provide a platform to register and it's more that they generate tokens that conform to the OpenID spec, then we would just need to dig a little bit into what that process looks like.
Neil, have you ever reached out to the people that run login.gov about this topic yet?
So I have tried to instigate that communication from some of the folks in Colorado's government, but I haven't, and well, I guess you're probably the closest to somebody who works for the Fed, one of those feds that, but I have not, I've had on my list, but yeah, just haven't gotten around to asking other folks. I don't even quite know who the right folks to ask would be.
So full disclosure, yes, maybe I happen to have friends. I don't represent the government formally as a NIST employee when I'm here. Prior to being a NIST employee, I actually was friends as a contractor in GSA with the people that were engineers there. You might want to actually open up a conversation, because my impression is that I have in NIST run proof of concept projects with the pre-production tier of login.gov, but with a very different use case and using a self-hosted, we'll call them permissioned blockchain solution, not to name names, but it was complicated. And I was one of the people proposing using an OIDC connector with login.gov and some cloud services. That being said, to use it in production requires a conversation. I believe it comes at cost. I don't know many people that are using login.gov in a commercial sense or in this free open source community area. However, they have security engineers who probably would be at least amenable to listening to this, but someone needs to talk to them about it. I don't know how often they permit that or do that. I have to actually read the documentation, because I knew that there would not be a production deployment of the thing I was working on at NIST or prior. In the SCITT context, I actually have tried thinking about prototype solutions involving it, but since that would require something interactive and difficult to maintain for reasons that are well beyond the interest of people in the call, it's something we could and should explore. We could talk about it on the mailing list, and maybe invite those people to understand what we're talking about and why, for them to say yes, no, maybe so. I don't know if people who are not login.gov federal employees register there, but that would expose them to a lot of people basically spinning up accounts, which they kind of allow on an application per application basis, but we're like not exactly a government project with like the IRS where people are registering, so I don't know what they'll say. So someone should ask them. That's the TLDR.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Now the government use cases are, to me, not the most interesting. I was actually curious, Hayden, as a lurker and someone using the public instance occasionally, how many people are running independent instances that are not public And do they talk about it with the maintainers or the developers of like the Sigstore open source code? And are they very active in coordinating with one another? Or is it just like things that I've worked on in government? We're not allowed to really ask for analytics purposes about people. So we know very little about, in many projects way outside of the SCITT area where I volunteered, I don't know how people were using my stuff. That was kind of by design.
Yeah, that's one of the I guess curious things here, working on an open source service and providing the code. There's I guess three camps. There's those who have explicitly said, hey, we're using this, and we have that documented on a landscape page hosted by the LF. Those are, you know, folks who just want to talk about, hey, we are integrating. There's those who I know are using it because they've come and asked questions on Slack or GitHub, and then there's those who we don't know who have deployed their own instances because they've never come and chatted before. So we don't have any, besides the landscape, anything official keeping track of things. Obviously, we don't have telemetry of those who are hosting their own instances. It's more when like use cases come up or there's certain PKI needs that they'll come reach out to the maintainers to learn a little bit more.
Interesting. And have there ever been challenges with the payloads and the things that people are signing? SCITT is kind of like, I don't know if you've read the SCITT standards. A lot of the questions you'll notice I'm asking are how SCITtable or how SCITT conformant is Sigstore. If you wanted to build downstream applications that look at Sigstore or other things, how hard would that be and why? So the last question I just asked, the payload, SCITT, for lack of a better word, there are other people in here that read the specification as much or more than me, will tell you the statement or the thing that we're talking about, the supply chain element that you analyze and you upload information about it. We call that like, so that thing under analysis is the artifact, and the statement can be, you know, to quote a partner's t-shirt, if a pizza can be made of cauliflower, I can be anything I want to be. It's fairly open-ended. I don't know how Sigstore, if there are interoperability challenges with people reporting on that.
Yeah, I've read over the SCITT standard. There's some questions around format, cozy being one of these things. Format is not something I think that's super blocking because we can decide on different formats. When it comes to what's signed and what's logged in the transparency log, ultimately it's a hash of an artifact. There's the transparency log provides APIs to try to simplify it for more complex artifacts that get signed. For example, you could upload an RPM or a Alpine image or a jar, and all that does is pretty much abstract away the logic from the clients to have to figure out how to parse it and get out the signature. We're looking at removing these because, one, they're not super used. Two, it adds a lot of complexity to the API, and I'd rather push this down to the client and say, ultimately, what the service does is provide logging over a signed digest. It's a lot simpler, and I think that actually somewhat maps closely to how SCITT has looked at it as well.
Cool. Registration policies, I don't know if we talk about that a lot. I don't know what the I don't really know in Sigstore if there are people running their own the public instance. I think by design is fairly permissive on what people can upload.
Yep.
There's a notion in SCITT that's TBD, really, because we're still reaching consensus on. I would say there are other people here who are more actively involved in SCITT. I'm like a contributor. There are people here that are more than just contributing, so they can clarify if I'm being too vague. We're talking about refining that concept in the specifications, right? Are people running non-public instances who talk about having more elaborate analysis of the statement as it's uploaded, to use the SCITT parlance, and choosing to be less permissive and being more specific about what they will and will not accept on upload? Beyond, I assume the hash is one thing, but I don't know if they look at things to hash.
That's come up before. Within the current Sigstore tooling, we don't support anything like that. I think it's a very reasonable feature to add, having some sort of policy layer, because you are right. The design of the transparency log for the public instance is that anybody can upload a tuple of a signature, an artifact hash, and then the verifier, a public key or a certificate that verifies the signature. just because you were able to upload that doesn't mean you actually generated it. And I think for some, especially for private instances, that's not what they might want. They might want, for example, to scope it down to domains that they only care about that are encoded in the certificate, for example. So I think this concept of registration policies will come up. I'd like to also start moving more towards a world where we have very easy to run transparency logs, and many of them rather than one single public instance. There are scalability concerns there. When it comes to monitoring the log, it means you're ingesting tons of entries that are not relevant at all to your use case. So that just takes time and compute. So seeing a lot of smaller logs with registration policies, I think is the direction that we'd like to go.
Very cool. I'll just be asking questions that pop into my head unless other people ask, so they should. Go ahead, Neil.
Let me just pop on that last idea. So from the standpoint of, some users, some verifiers having the ability to say, well, what I care about is people who are registered this way, and that way I have less to wade through, that makes sense. But at the other end, something that, one of the use cases that we've discussed, I think, in lots of places is an intentionally open-ended thing where you don't restrict who gets to point out flaws in your software. It's like there is a vulnerability in that thing and they don't want to admit it, and maybe they don't define vulnerabilities the same way I do, but I want it to be very clear to anyone who ever looks for product X that that there is this issue, or a range of use cases where people want to say things about that others don't want said. So how do those two worlds optimally fit together?
Yeah, if I can jump in, and apologies, I can only make the first half of this, so I'm going to come and go quite quickly. But that's essentially where the outstanding debate is. My long-held opinion, which I state, but otherwise, as a co-chair, don't do anything about. But when facilitating these conversations, my feeling on why the registration policies topic is so fraught is because it is trying to achieve two different things at once. There's a level of access control, which is a kind of legitimate management of objects in some kind of remote store. And there are some really nice features of the SCITT architecture that lead to this, because we have, for example, a hard and sensible separation of the credential that allows you to make a REST API call, which kind of vaguely proves roughly which computer you were on, or at the very worst, which of your computers some attacker was on and stole your credential. But it's still a pretty decent locator. And then the issuer signature, which is the thing that signs the statement itself, which can be prepared somewhere completely different using different protections. It can be done offline even, and has a much better approximation of telling you who actually made this statement. So there's lots of stuff about that access control that makes a ton of sense. And then, as you said, Neil, precisely those bits that you're picking on there are the bits that I certainly have a lot of trouble codifying sufficiently to put them in an IETF style standard, which is it legitimate for a software vendor to prevent people from making observations about their software? And clearly the answer is no. And if you try to solve that, there are two ways to solve that. You can either say anybody can make any observation they like, and it is up to the consumer to decide which sources of information they trust for which things. That's my preferred model. I think that's how I live in human society. Or we got into discussions about sort of universal, unique identifiers, and having spent some years in the original SBOM stuff, we know that way madness lies. So there's there's some real nice access control and object management stuff in there, and there's some good intent in the registration policy stuff which I think needs to come back at some point. But yeah, that's why it's an interesting topic, is we're trying to kind of solve two different access things for two different types of identity in one object, and it's just hard.
Can you expand on the second half of that? Because we're definitely in sync on the first one, and I think ultimately, as you know, at least when I was more participating a year ago, the notion that consumers ultimately always have to decide who to trust. But
Yeah,
if you had the universal unique identifiers, you're saying for, and forgive me, I'm way behind. Are there names for the two pieces that you're separating the kind of access control for the API versus the signatures on the claims or whatever?
yeah. So the one of the places where that becomes interesting is that kind of RBAC style access to making calls into a transparency service would typically be based on some kind of claim in a JWT or whatnot. That's the way the Scrappy's going. It makes a lot of sense. It's easy. It can be auto-generated, so it's, you know, the adoption barrier is much lower, which helps with a lot of these use cases we've been talking about. So that's all cool, but actually it's the issuer identity that is the more pertinent here. So I couldn't really care less necessarily if an unauthenticated endpoint just grape shot a whole ton of things at me, if the payload inside is properly signed and says, yeah, somebody with access to a whatever YouGov key did sign a statement saying that you should never ever trust this website anymore, or this software payload or whatever. So the identity management of the issuer certificate, the first thing, which is totally achievable, and everybody in the group knows how to do this because we've been doing it for 30 years. But you then have to tie that also to an idea of, well, what's the identity of the object? And if people are walking around with receipts from a transparency service, if I make a claim about glass A and you also make a claim about glass A, are they the same thing? And well, if you make a claim about that on the same transparency service, now, are they the same thing? And so on and so forth. So we just get into these questions of all of the usual things about what is a durable and unique identifier for a specific object versus what's an identifier which is consistent only within its own series. I think that's, I appreciate that's not the clearest statement, but I think it is the most accurate statement for the puzzle we've been trying to solve.
Thank you.
Hayden.
One of the things too to consider here is how we define exactly what it means to have an entry in the log. There's a model that we follow called the claimant model, which was defined by the folks who work on Trillion, which is our log backend. And I think this is kind of one of the things, Jon, you're getting at here, that when an entry goes into the log, if the log is very permissive, the exact claim is not very precise. This is true, for example, within Sigstore. It's roughly there exists some signature over a hash. When you start talking about adding things like policies, you can get something more precise, which is somebody has made some claim, or you start getting into a world where maybe it's not even about signatures. Maybe we're talking about things like binary transparency, and you can make claims around there exists only one artifact hash in the log, which is a very different claim than there exists some signed hash in the log where there may be many signatures for one hash. So I think that's something also that's worth defining here, exactly what is the claim that we are talking about, because it sounds like there's a few different claims and there's a few different use cases. This is one of the things I love about working in transparency, that there are many different ways of representing what you might want to put into the log. And of course, this is also one of the complex parts of it, that if you don't clearly define exactly what your claim here is, it becomes very hard to know when you're talking about verification of the log itself, what are you actually verifying? Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, the link here is to the claimant model. We define one of these for Sigstore. I've seen a few defined for some of the other transparency logs that are floating about online as well.
Great, thanks. So yeah, apologies, I just dropped again, but hopefully that small interjection was helpful. I think the layering is very similar. The question is which bits need to belong in which layer of architecture, and we've got a quite nice way of identifying what you're talking about, which I kind of think is kind of essential for indexing, but some of the finer detail of the who did what, when, why, where, and for what, those are not. Which I actually think is a good thing, because it sounds like we're more aligned. You know, there's more opportunity of interoperability there with the Sigstore and SCITT, that those things are not baked than if they were.
And I'll also mention on this topic, I've been chatting with Ori. He's going to be presenting in Sigstore's community meeting next week. He has some slides on opportunities for interoperability between the two. So if you're interested in coming as well, that should be at 9:30 PST on the 11th.
Interesting. Who's Ori?
Yeah.
That's a joke. That's a joke. I'm just surprised. I'm surprised he hasn't mentioned it yet. We all talk to him often. For people on the call or in the recording, Ori Steele is one of the heavier contributors to the SCITT architecture and Scrappy documents. If you don't know, but you probably do, because you probably see the email come up a lot. I know John does, and I know I do, and probably Neil. So.
Yes.
Cool.
It's exciting.
Well, I'm struggling to edit the HackMD, but just as a parting shot, I've just spent the last 2 days sitting in the UN AI for Good conference on stage next to people from CTPA and CAI, among others. And I'm very well aware of the Neil Kravetz's blog that's in there. I have a 1-minute demo video showing exactly where SCITT fits in this, which I'll happily publish. But when I'm able to edit HackMD, I'm not quite sure what it went at me at the moment. I'll stick my name on that.
You mean this one right here? Is it this document you're trying to edit, John?
Yeah, exactly that one. Yes.
Just log into GitHub or something. HackMD has a weird interface. Yeah. Been there, done that so many times. Until SCITT.io grows its own self-hosted HackMD where all the notes become attested would be funny about this. Well, not because it's not great work. But...
I've got a video.
No, we're not going to let you make that statement. We are too good for that. Yeah.
So I think we would love if people post and listen, and they also want to share these things asynchronously or in these meetings. We had a long conversation. I don't know if we recorded because it was more like, what should we talk about in the last meeting? What should we talk about in future meetings in the last meeting? And we had a long, I think Neil and Steve and Steve Lasker and I had a conversation about C2PA. So
great.
Neil's
so I've got a demo integration. I'll do that next time.
I was surprised to learn that C2PA is kind of like the opposite of what I would expect from people in this area. Not to speak ill of it. I just didn't realize that it was embedding data, but like you could easily peel the data out. I didn't know if there are any things that are emerging in C2PA or in alternative mechanisms where you could basically ingrain information in an image or a video such that if you took it out, it would destroy the video. Like it would be missing. And that actually is the key, basically the hashing material. I found out the C2PA doesn't really work that way, which was kind of a surprise to me. So basically, you can just strip it out.
Yeah, it doesn't yet, but there are moves afoot to do that.
Okay, now I'm excited.
So at whatever point it gets published, I'll put a link out. But my presentation, I think, yeah, that's the one now. So I was presenting in 2 sessions there, and the 3-legged stool of watermarks, content credentials, and durable ledgers is the thing that makes all this stuff hang together, because the ledger can reunite stripped content, the watermarks can help you identify where the ledger lives, and so on and so forth. So yeah, those 3 things together is a pretty powerful solution. Any 2 of them on their own kind of lacking. So yeah, I'll send it around.
Fantastic.
So riff a little bit more on that notion of being able to pull something out and how that might be being looked at.
You mean what I said?
What you said.
There's no like watermarking or anything like that. So if you wanted to know someone had tampered with it, the from what I understand, you or I or other people in this call would have the technical acumen and build systems based on that acumen to look at an image and know in the metadata that there is information that transparently can be communicated about this is an authentic image and someone published it somewhere. John left, but they already, not just his company, but I didn't realize how many people, I think you and I talked about the Guardian project. I didn't realize they have their own, I don't think so skittable, to use a word I make up, solution with blockchain and registering that information with C2PA signatures, or at least conforming to that specification. Full disclosure, I haven't read it in depth because I'm so busy, but realistically distracted by other things. You could just pull that out and an end user wouldn't notice the difference. Actually training people to
could pull what out?
The metadata that is used for C2PA signing and authenticity.
So someone can take a signed image and say, yeah, but here's my own naked image. And yeah, of course.
It'd be interesting. Now, most people probably wouldn't like this, but a higher security model to me would be actually visual artifacts in an image or in different segments of the video that an end user would notice if they had been missing, so it could be easily visually compared. And something that's not so easy to trim and is like it would look ugly, but something that's very high visibility would be embedded such that if that's removed, you could train a generation of people to either know it's gone or be skeptical and verify something that doesn't look quite the same. Because you could probably find, if there's a visual artifact, you can probably find ways to fake it and use that as a way to get non-technical or non-engineering people that are in a community to start thinking about opting to just in time validate media that they receive. Now, I don't really know if that's a viable thing. I actually haven't even looked into literature. Maybe given my research role and what I do day job wise, I should look into that and write about it. But John just confirmed there are people thinking about that C2PA. I was just surprised because I think this is like the underlying thesis of what Neil was talking about, which is like, I can not only easily strip the necessary metadata, I can switch it out. And as the specification exists and a solution implementation he coded, you wouldn't know the difference, that he could fake information. That being said, I wasn't there for the presentation. I just have read some of his claims on a mailing list.
Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you.
Yeah. And if people know about that, that's fun. Like no one looks at a binary or a piece of software and goes, "Ooh, I want to be able to eyeball it." In software, there are binary equivalents to this, right? But you can build security mechanisms such that you try tampering with an executable. It misbehaves because of stack cookies and things like that. Building deeper digital signature information into every possible application, then finding setting booby traps for removing it is probably so complicated and not worthwhile. And no one really does that. So few people seem to be actually validating binaries they use. This is not like the engineers who build the systems. I don't know, maybe Hayden or other people have impressions about this. I find Sigstore fascinating. Even in the technical communities, I'm surprised no one's really measuring the shift of how few people actually care about digital signing. If we think about the percentage of people, I don't know if the number's going up or down, even though there's lots of signaling industry-wise, non-governmental, non-industry experts, and then government experts saying supply chain security matters or runtime security matters. I don't know if anyone's ever measuring in the world how people are actually validating signatures in the post PGP signing world. I'm definitely in a minority in my friend group.
Verification is super interesting. I think it's one of the larger gaps that exists right now across the entire ecosystem. Because we're kind of at the state where, all right, I'm happy with the tooling that Sigstore offers. We see a lot of signatures being generated. Now the next question is, okay, how do we simplify verification and make it as straightforward as possible? Ultimately, I think what this comes down to is finding the right opportunities for, who's integrating. For example, Homebrew recently added supports for verification of attestations, which were generated through GitHub Actions, which use Sigstore to sign. And, Homebrew is a very unique case here because when it comes to verification, they know who is the right identity that was used to sign a thing. So there's this really nice, tight, closed loop. And I think that's where verification is complex, because ultimately there is some identity, whether that be a key hint or whether that be somebody's email address or a workload identity that's needed in order to verify a signature. And how you represent that verification policy, I think is one of the interesting challenges. Either you have a mechanism like Tofu where first identity you see, that's what gets baked in. I think there's some interesting opportunities to talk about transparency here, where even if there is Tofu, we're committing to a log, the mapping between who's allowed to sign for an artifact and the artifact. Now this becomes auditable. So even if you have something like Tofu, again, the system becomes auditable. So I think concretely, I don't know if anybody is measuring verification. I think it would have to come from some sort of client. For example, you could talk about if you're looking at package registry integrations, things like NPM, seeing statistics from there. If they have any sort of metrics around who's actually running, I think it's the NPM audit command to verify the Sigstore signed attestations.
Yeah. I put it on the list because I think that's something we could. I actually have looked precious little into this, and you're right. It's also complicated. Not like the making it easier part. Like how can you measure it also in a way that if you're in this kind of niche, you probably will opt out or demand people make it mandatory opt-in and don't do it by default to actually measure a lot of these things. But I think about this often. I kind of do temperature checks with my friends who are the least security paranoid and the ones who are exploit developers and the ones that should be most paranoid. They do like ethical hacking in their day jobs. I'm surprised how few of them really think about the authenticity of their artifacts, even for malware, is actually pretty funny. So I haven't noticed a big shift outside of the people that are in this niche who talk about it a lot. Outside of that, but again, that's very subjective.
Well, ultimately, my goal is that verification should be invisible.
True.
Because we all as security folks, especially working in this space, we'll do the extra steps necessary to verify this. But when it comes to signing, it's kind of the same approach that we've done, which is let signing hopefully be as lightweight as possible, where users don't have to think about, for example, the management of keys. That was one of the motivations of Sigstore. So you can start getting to a world where you already have an identity. We can automate signing. It becomes a lot easier. We have to apply the same sort of ideas to verification.
How do you use Sigstore? Oh, go ahead, Neil.
No, go.
Do you often? One of the challenges I've had, not with, I don't know if it's called Sigstore. Is it Raycore search? I don't know if you, or is it Sigstore search?
The Raycore search UI, I think that's
yes.
The front end. Yeah.
I'm going to ask some obtuse questions because I've been embarrassed. Mm-hmm. Is the intent that people try to find the email address of the signing identity? Because it's harder to find than I thought. And I don't expect Google to have, for example, the reason I point out Google is because they actually have some very valid images, not because I want to poke fun at them. They're also like one of the bigger users for like Kubernetes and a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. I don't expect them to publish an email address that's like an engineering group that actually tries to get work done. But I actually had trouble figuring out this part of how do you, as a human user and engineer, how are you going the reverse direction, like knowing some kind of identity around a domain or the full email address and looking. Is that the primary use case of it? Do you know much about that? Is that like I assume that's like a separate group of people really working on that?
That is a great question. And I think actually one of the challenges that has come up with this, I would like, so this is kind of my view of this. So I would like the transparency log to be exclusively a record of signatures. How you ingest that kind of becomes up to the user. And if we want to build a search index on top of that, which is effectively like what you see in Recourse search, when you type in an email, it's actually hitting, we have a separate search index that's running currently effectively alongside Recourse. I would like to see that split out so we can actually start talking about what it might mean to query this data. It's a different trust model. Transparency logs are designed to be trustless. You're effectively verifying that, when given a signature hash and a verifier, you go look in the log to see, yes, this has been committed in the log with an inclusion proof. When we talk about searching the log, now you are trusting the log to present to you its data. And there's a really interesting field also of like verifiable search, which hasn't really been explored very much, and starts getting into some concepts around verifiable map constructions as well, which is super interesting research. Eventually, I'd love to see us go there. So I would actually like to have a very explicit divide between the log and a search index. I would not like to have a thing called Recourse search, to be honest, because it introduces this point of confusion, which is something that's come up many, many times. It also lets us, I think, be a bit more explicit when we're running a search index about what's going into there. How do you index more values? How do you run your own for your own instance? Whereas right now, when you're querying Recourse search, certain things hit the log. Like if you're searching, for example, like by log index, that will actually go return you an inclusion proof that you're not trusting the log any more than anything else that presents cryptographic proof. If you type an email, it hits an index, which is not technically the log. So it's a great question.
Fair enough. You gave me things to look up as research topics. So people are working on verifiable map structures, like a data structure. I had not even read about, or I've never heard the term before.
Yeah, there in the link that Isaac left earlier, Trillion actually I think had an example of this a little while ago, where they were exploring verifiable map constructions. But I think there's also some more novel research also in academia around this as well.
Oh boy, you've increased a very long reading list already, so I'm excited for that. Thank you. I've exhausted a lot of my questions, so people could ask what they want. We can break early. We can talk about other things they wish other people would talk about in these meetings and like post something.
Well, Alex, I completely agree with your earlier comment that this is just the kind of discussion that I am very happy to see here, and thank you for making it happen. So didn't want to interrupt anything. Keep going, but kudos.
I didn't make anything happen. I don't know, Hayden, if you showed up of your own volition. Hayden made it happen by showing up, and I had no idea Hayden was showing up. So thank you for showing up. Keep doing that.
I say,
or tell other people.
I mean, I love these types of conversations. So +1.
Yeah. When we say like the SCITT community, I try to frame in the like if people watch the recording, we do post them on YouTube eventually based on AJ's focus and level of. If you can't tell, Alexander, I'm AJ. If you're watching this recording after it's been published, we want to talk about not just the IETF specifications and people conforming to it, but kind of how that fits into the ecosystem. The transparency.dev people are fascinating. You probably are on that, or you've seen that website. They have a whole Slack community. Apparently, there's going to inevitably be a summit of some kind, which is very interesting. I guess someone should cross-post about that. But I see there's like this. There are these islands that are starting to bridge across each other. So, not just talking about SCITT, but like what is skittable, what isn't. Like where's their like the pain point, and like what are the alternatives and where things go well is exciting to me. So I don't see a lot of people writing on these topics or doing anything yet, but I'll get a clip soon and we'll be fine. So hopefully we can have lots of cool links. The SCITT.io website needs a lot of love, so I'm part of that. Should be more already, but maybe this week I'll focus. So yeah. All right.
Well, back to my original question. So who's the best person to contact about login.gov or the...
That I actually don't know. So the people that I used to directly interact with are gone. However, I do know some people there, and they have a support email address. I think we should... Let me find out if you can send an email to them, and then like individuals or the support list, and it would be interesting to also CC the list and be like, so this is why we're asking, and be like, do you want to understand? We can give you an elevator pitch. This is no one's really going to fund this, and this is not like an official customer. Is this something you'd consider, and do you want to come to one of our community meetings, recorded or not, and we can discuss why, and then you can think about it. That being said, the specific individuals I knew 2 years ago have moved on. So I'm still friendly with some people on that side of the fence. And they were involved in other NIST and voluntary standards organization standards, or like draft specifications. So I'll reach out and see what they'll say. I would encourage you, since you're the most interested, to reach out. So I'll facilitate that, because me reaching out there, not that interesting.
Oh, of course, sure.
But yes. So inevitably, also, I would love a presentation on, or like you can talk about more in depth about where you're at with what you were doing and how people could get involved.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah. So, all right. Sorry, to go back to the original question, for people who love recordings, and to be fair to Neil, I don't know the specific person or persons to email, but I will find out those people to email so you can address them correctly, and I'll send you an email. Also,
Super.
blasting it on a YouTube video anyone can find will be a funny way. They'll be like, thank you. Always great to be friends with you, AJ, if it was people I was still friends with. So, working there. Yeah.
Thank you, AJ.
All right. Well, I guess that's it for now. Until next time. Unless anyone's got anything. Going once. Going twice. 3.5 times. All right. Thank you, everybody. See y'all later.
Thanks,
Nice meeting you.